The Silence of the Roses, Chapter 1, The Hidden Drawer. The afternoon sun, a soft Charleston gold, filtered through the lace curtains of Clara Jenkins' living room. It was a quiet day, too quiet, perhaps. Clara, a woman of 68 years, whose elegance seemed woven into the very fabric of her being, moved with a gentle precision that belied the tremor in her hands. Her late husband, Arthur, had been gone 5 years now. 5 years, and the house still echoed with his absence. Especially today. Today, she'd decided to finally sort through his old sheet music, stacked precariously inside the bench of his beloved baby grand piano, a task she'd avoided. Each page, she knew, would be a memory. She lifted the lid of the piano bench. The familiar scent of aged paper and lemon oil greeted her. Arthur had always kept things meticulously, or so she thought. As she carefully lifted a stack of Chopin nocturnes, her fingers brushed against something solid at the bottom. A false bottom? No, it seemed to be a shallow drawer she'd never noticed. Her heart gave a little flutter. A secret? Arthur wasn't a man of secrets, was he? With a curious hesitation, she pressed a nearly invisible indentation. A faint click, and a thin wooden panel slid open, revealing a compartment no bigger than a shoebox. Inside lay a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed, the ink blurred in places, and nestled beside them, a tiny tarnished silver rattle. It was intricately carved, with the initials AJJ intertwined on its handle. Clara's breath caught in her throat. AJJ, Arthur Jenkins, Jr., but they never had children. It was a quiet sorrow they had shared, a path not taken. Her Arthur, her kind, scholarly Arthur. Who was this woman, Sophia, whose name was signed in a looping, passionate script on the envelopes addressed to Arthur Jenkins, Sq., at an old New Orleans address, an address from before they were married, long before. Her hands, now visibly shaking, reached for the first letter. The paper felt fragile, like a dried leaf. "My dearest Arthur," it began, "the city feels empty without your laughter. Our little star shines brighter every day, a testament to the love we shared under the Louisiana moon." Little star? Clara's mind reeled. She sank onto the piano bench, the scent of old paper now heavy, cloying. The Chopin lay forgotten on the floor. The silence of the room pressed in, broken only by the frantic beating of her own heart. Her Arthur. What didn't she know? What life had he lived before her? A life that included a woman named Sophia and a child. The rattle felt cold in her palm. AJJ. The silver seemed to mock her, a tiny gleaming question mark in the carefully constructed narrative of her marriage. The roses in her garden, Arthur's favorite peace roses, suddenly seemed too bright, too cheerful, their fragrance a cruel irony against the sudden, bitter taste of betrayal welling up inside her. This wasn't just a hidden drawer. This was a hidden life. And Clara, in the golden afternoon light of her quiet Charleston home, felt a chasm open beneath her feet. Chapter 2. Whispers from New Orleans. Days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and anxious dawns. Clara kept the letters and the rattle hidden, even from her closest friend, Grace Simmons. How could she voice such a suspicion? How could she tarnish the memory of Arthur, a man universally respected, adored? Yet, the image of Sophia and the little star haunted her. Each glance at Arthur's portrait above the mantelpiece, his kind eyes, his gentle smile, now felt like a fresh wound. The letters, oh, the letters. There were only 7 of them, written over a span of about 2 years. They spoke of stolen moments, of music, of a love that was apparently as vibrant as it was, seemingly, doomed. Sophia's words painted a picture of a lively, passionate woman. A jazz singer, Clara deduced from one passage mentioning a smoky club on Bourbon Street and my voice reaching for the notes you taught me. Arthur had a beautiful baritone voice, though he rarely sang after they married. Our little secret, Sophia wrote in another, is a bond stronger than any vow spoken in daylight. A secret, a child. Clara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Arthur had been in New Orleans for a brief period working on his doctoral research. He'd told her it was a lonely time filled with dusty archives. He'd never mentioned a Sophia, never a hint of a child. Clara finally confided in Grace, her voice trembling as she laid out the letters and the rattle on Grace's antique mahogany desk in her little shop on King Street. Grace, ever practical, listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern. "Clara, dear," she said softly, her hand covering Clara's. "This is a shock. But Arthur loved you, more than anything." "Grace?" Clara whispered, tears finally spilling over. "Or was I just the comfortable choice? The safe harbor after a storm he never told me about?" "Don't do that to yourself," Grace insisted. "There has to be an explanation. People are complex. Their pasts are complex." Grace, true to her nature, suggested a course of action. New Orleans. The letters mention places. Perhaps you need to see for yourself. The thought terrified Clara. New Orleans, a city of jazz and shadows, of a past her husband had buried. But the alternative, living with this gnawing uncertainty, this ghost of Sophia and her child, was unbearable. Meanwhile, in New York City, Olivia Hayes, a journalist known for her sharp intellect and even sharper prose, was feeling restless. Her editor had just handed her a fluff piece assignment, Forgotten Love Stories of the South. Charleston was on her list. "Find something with heart, Olivia," her editor had said. "Something that resonates." Olivia, more accustomed to investigative pieces, had sighed internally. But a change of scenery might be good. She packed her bags, a sense of professional duty warring with a deeper, unacknowledged yearning for something more, something real. Clara, armed with Grace's reluctant support and a small suitcase, booked a flight to Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport. She had to know. She had to find Sophia, or at least what remained of her story. The silver rattle, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, lay in her purse, a cold, heavy weight against her heart. Chapter 3. The Scent of Magnolia and Mystery. New Orleans was a sensory overload. The humid air, thick with the scent of sweet olive and damp earth, the distant mournful cry of a saxophone, the vibrant, chaotic energy of the French Quarter. It was a world away from the genteel quiet of Charleston. Clara felt small, out of place. She checked into a modest hotel, her courage wavering. The letters were her only guide. Sophia had mentioned the Blue Moon Club on Bourbon Street. Armed with a city map, Clara ventured out. Bourbon Street, even in the daytime, was overwhelming. But tucked away on a quieter side street, she found it, or what was left of it. The Blue Moon Club was now a souvenir shop, garish and loud. Disappointment washed over her. Of course, it was too long ago. Decades. She wandered, aimless, through the quarter, the letters clutched in her bag. She found the address where Arthur had stayed, a grand, slightly dilapidated boarding house near Esplanade Avenue. The current owner, an elderly Creole woman with knowing eyes, remembered nothing of a young historian named Arthur Jenkins. So many faces, Cherie, she'd said with a sigh, like leaves on the Mississippi. Days passed in a frustrating haze. Clara visited archives, libraries, pored over old city directories. The name Sophia Dubois, she'd finally found a surname in a postscript, yielded nothing concrete. It was a common enough name. She was chasing a ghost. Back in Charleston, Grace was worried. Clara's daily calls were strained, her voice thin. "Perhaps you should come home, dear," Grace suggested gently. "Not yet, Grace," Clara insisted, a new steely resolve in her tone. "I can't. Not yet." It was Grace who inadvertently provided the next clue. Olivia Hayes had arrived in Charleston and, through a mutual acquaintance, had been directed to Grace's antique shop as a source of local color and history. Olivia, with her reporter's instinct, quickly sensed Grace's underlying anxiety. "You seem troubled," Olivia observed, her gaze direct but not unkind. Grace, usually reserved, found herself confiding in this sharp young woman from New York. She didn't reveal all of Clara's secrets, but spoke of a dear friend researching a painful family mystery in New Orleans, hitting dead ends. Olivia, intrigued, listened intently. "New Orleans, you say? What kind of mystery?" Grace hesitated, then mentioned a name, Sophia Dubois, and a time frame, the early 1970s. "My friend is looking for a jazz singer." A spark ignited in Olivia's eyes. This was more interesting than forgotten valentines and dusty attics. "I have some contacts in New Orleans," she said. "Old journalism colleagues. Maybe I can make a few calls." And just like that, a lifeline was thrown. Olivia's contacts, seasoned reporters who knew the city's underbelly and its cultural history, began to dig. Within days, a piece of the puzzle emerged. Sophia Dubois hadn't just been any jazz singer. She'd been a rising star, a voice that promised greatness, her career tragically cut short. Olivia called Grace, her voice crisp with information. "Grace, I found something. Sophia Dubois. She died in a fire at a club called the Starlight Lounge. It seems the Blue Moon changed its name. 1974. Grace felt a chill. Died. She immediately called Clara. Clara was sitting in Jackson Square, watching the artists and tarot readers, feeling defeated. The news from Grace hit her like a physical blow. Sophia was dead. All these years, dead. The anger, the jealousy she'd harbored towards this unknown woman dissolved into a profound, unexpected sadness. And a new question arose, sharper, more urgent. What happened to the child, the little star? Chapter 4, The Journalist and the Secret. Olivia Hayes, her journalistic instincts now fully engaged, decided Charleston could wait. This New Orleans story had layers, a tragic depth that called to her. She flew to New Orleans herself, armed with her notebook and a relentless curiosity. She met Clara at her hotel. Clara, pale and drawn, was initially wary of this energetic young journalist. But Olivia's empathy, her genuine interest in Sophia's story, slowly won her over. Together, they revisited the site of the Starlight Lounge. It was now a nondescript office building. Nothing remained of the music, the laughter, the tragedy. Olivia, however, was a professional. She knew how to unearth buried stories. She delved into newspaper archives, police reports, old court documents. The fire at the Starlight Lounge had been devastating. Several lives were lost. Sophia Dubois was among them. The reports mentioned she had a young child, an infant son, who had miraculously survived, rescued by a quick-thinking busboy. The child's father was listed as unknown or whereabouts unknown. The baby, an Arthur James, was temporarily placed in state care. Arthur James, Clara breathed, looking at the faded newsprint Olivia had uncovered. AJJ, it has to be him, her son, Arthur's son. The silver rattle suddenly felt heavier than ever. Olivia, meanwhile, pursued another angle. If the child was put into state care, there would be records. Adoption records were sealed, notoriously difficult to access. But Olivia was persistent. She found a retired social worker, a woman named Mrs. Thibodeau, who had worked on the periphery of the case. Mrs. Thibodeau, her memory hazy at first, eventually recalled the baby from the Starlight Lounge fire. Such a tragedy, that fire, she said, her voice soft with remembered sorrow. That poor child. His mother, a beautiful singer, they said. The father, well, there were rumors. A young man, educated, from out of town. He visited the child at the orphanage a few times, distraught. Then he vanished, said he couldn't take the boy. Not then. Promised to come back. But, she shrugged, life happens. Did he give a name? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Thibodeau frowned, searching her memory. Jenkins, I think. Yes, Jenkins. A common name, but it stuck with me. He seemed so torn. Jenkins. Arthur. Her Arthur. Clara felt a wave of dizziness. He knew. He knew about the child, his son. He'd seen him, and then he'd walked away. The pain was immense. A betrayal far deeper than infidelity. He had abandoned his own child. Why, Arthur? She whispered to the empty air of her hotel room later that night, clutching the letters. Why? Back in Charleston, an unfamiliar man had been seen asking questions around Rainbow Row. A man in his late 40s, early 50s, with a searching look in his eyes. He'd asked specifically about the Jenkins house, about Arthur Jenkins. Grace, alerted by a neighbor, felt a prickle of unease. She tried to reach Clara, but Clara wasn't answering her phone. She was lost in her grief, in the newly discovered, devastating truth about her husband. This man, Daniel Peterson, had driven all the way from Chicago. In his possession was a worn birth certificate, listing his mother as Sophia Dubois, and a small, faded photograph of a young woman with laughing eyes, holding a baby. For years, he had known he was adopted. His loving adoptive parents had recently passed away, leaving him a box of his birth mother's effects, including letters hinting at a father he never knew, a father in Charleston. His search had finally led him here. He was looking for Arthur Jenkins. He was looking for answers. Chapter 5, The Unveiling. Olivia, sensing Clara was near a breaking point, gently persuaded her to return to Charleston. You need to be home, Clara, she said. We can continue this from there. You're not alone in this anymore. Clara, exhausted and heartsick, agreed. The flight back was a blur. As she stepped into her house, the familiar scent of roses and old books felt alien, tainted by the secrets the walls now seemed to hold. Grace was there, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. Clara, there's something you need to know, she began, then hesitated. There's a man. He's been asking about Arthur. His name is Daniel Peterson. Clara stared at her. Daniel Peterson? The name meant nothing. And yet, it was Olivia, with her quick mind, who made the connection. Peterson. Could that be his adoptive name, she mused? The child, Arthur James. If he was adopted. The pieces began to click into place, forming a horrifying, yet undeniably logical picture. The next day, Daniel Peterson returned. Grace had left a message for him, suggesting he come to Clara's house. He arrived, looking nervous but determined. He was a tall man, with Arthur's dark hair and Sophia's intense gaze. The resemblance, once you knew what to look for, was unmistakable. Clara opened the door. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Clara saw the ghost of her husband, the echo of a love she never knew. Daniel saw a woman who was a stranger, yet intrinsically linked to the father he'd never met. Olivia, ever the quiet facilitator, gently broke the silence. "Mr. Peterson, please come in. This is Mrs. Clara Jenkins, Arthur Jenkins' wife." The air in the living room was thick with unspoken emotions. Daniel, or Arthur James Jenkins Jr., as Clara now thought of him, explained his search, his voice quiet but firm. He spoke of a good life with his adoptive parents, but always a sense of something missing, a question mark at the core of his identity. He presented the few mementos he had of Sophia, the photograph, a few playbills. Clara listened, her heart aching. This was Arthur's son. Standing in Arthur's living room, she saw the hurt in his eyes, the years of wondering. Then, with trembling hands, Clara retrieved the hidden box, laid the letters on the coffee table, and beside them, the small silver rattle. AJJ. Daniel's eyes widened. He picked up the rattle, his fingers tracing the initials. My mother mentioned a rattle in one of her letters to him. She said he'd given it to her. He kept these, Clara said, her voice thick with tears. All these years, he kept them. And this. She showed him the letters from Sophia. She loved you very much, and she loved your father. For Daniel, it was overwhelming. Proof. Tangible proof of a past he'd only been able to imagine. He read Sophia's words, his expression shifting from disbelief to sorrow, to a dawning understanding. Olivia watched them, her reporter's notebook forgotten. This was no longer a story to be written. It was a life unfolding, raw and poignant. "Your father," Clara began, then stopped. How could she explain Arthur? The man she loved, the man who had hidden so much. He wasn't a bad man, Daniel. I think he was haunted by choices he made, by a past he couldn't escape. She told him about Arthur's research in New Orleans, about his youth, his ambition. She spoke of the fire, the news of Sophia's death. He must have been devastated, lost. She didn't try to excuse Arthur's abandonment of his son, but she tried to paint a picture of a man caught in an impossible situation, a young man who perhaps felt he had nothing to offer a child at that tumultuous point in his life. A man who then built a different life, a life with her, a life where that early chapter remained sealed. But why didn't he ever tell me? Clara whispered, the question hanging in the air, addressed as much to herself as to Daniel. Why carry that burden alone? Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. The revelation settled over them, heavy and profound. Daniel spent hours that day with Clara, poring over Sophia's letters, sharing the few memories he had gleaned from his adoptive parents about his birth mother. Clara, in turn, showed him photographs of Arthur, told him stories of their life together in Charleston, the quiet years, the shared joys, the unspoken sorrows. Olivia, observing them, realized the complexity of Arthur Jenkins, not a villain, not a saint, but a man who had made difficult choices, choices that had rippled through decades, shaping lives in ways he might never have intended. Perhaps he had intended to find his son one day. Perhaps fear, or shame, or simply the passage of time had kept him silent. The why might forever remain elusive. Grace joined them later, bringing food and a comforting presence. She looked at Daniel, at this living, breathing piece of Arthur's hidden past, and then at Clara, whose face, though etched with sadness, also held a new kind of peace. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant sorrow and a dawning acceptance. He talked about New Orleans sometimes, Clara recalled, her voice soft, always with a wistfulness. I thought it was just nostalgia for his youth. Now, she trailed off. Now those memories were cast in a different light. The shadows had names, faces. Daniel learned that his father had been a respected historian, a man of books and quiet contemplation. It was a stark contrast to the image of the young, possibly reckless man who had loved a jazz singer in the vibrant chaos of New Orleans. He saw the home Arthur had built with Clara, the garden Arthur had tended with such care. He saw the life his father had chosen. Did he ever speak of me? Daniel asked, the question almost a whisper. Or of her? Clara shook her head slowly. No, not directly, but sometimes he would get this distant look in his eyes, especially when he played the piano. He'd play these melancholic jazz tunes. I always wondered where they came from. Now she knew they came from Sophia, from a time of love and loss. As evening approached, Daniel prepared to leave. He was staying at a hotel, needing time to process everything. Thank you, Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion, for sharing this with me, for not turning me away. You are Arthur's son, Clara replied, a fragile smile on her lips. You are family. The word felt strange, yet right. After he left, Clara walked into her rose garden. The peace roses, Arthur's favorites, glowed in the twilight. For so long, she had associated them with her peaceful, predictable life with Arthur. Now their beauty seemed to hold a deeper meaning, a testament to the complexities of love, the endurance of memory, and the possibility of finding peace, even after the storms of revelation. Arthur's silence had been a heavy weight, a burden he carried alone. Now, that silence was broken, and in its place, there was a story. A painful story, yes, but a human story. A story of love, loss, and the enduring echoes of the past. Olivia stayed with Clara for a while longer. What will you do now? She asked gently. Clara looked out at the darkening garden. I don't know, she admitted, but for the first time in a long time, I don't feel quite so alone with his memory. He's more real to me now, flaws and all. And perhaps that's a kind of peace too. She thought of Daniel, a new connection, a living link to Arthur's hidden heart. The journey had been painful, but it had led her not to a betrayal, but to a fuller understanding of the man she had loved, and unexpectedly, to a son she never knew she had. Chapter 7. A new melody. The days that followed were filled with a quiet intensity. Daniel extended his stay in Charleston. He and Clara spent hours together, piecing together the fragments of Arthur's life and Sophia's brief, bright existence. They visited Arthur's grave. It was a somber, reflective moment. For Daniel, it was a meeting that had come too late, yet was profoundly necessary. For Clara, it was a chance to say a different kind of goodbye to her husband. A goodbye that acknowledged the entirety of his life, not just the part she had known. Olivia found herself becoming more than just an observer. She became a friend, a gentle guide through the emotional labyrinth they were all navigating. Her article on forgotten love stories was taking a very different shape now. A story about the enduring power of truth, the complexities of forgiveness, and the unexpected ways families can be formed and reformed. With Clara's blessing and Olivia's help, began to look into his mother's family. Sophia, it turned out, had been an orphan herself, raised by a distant aunt in rural Louisiana. Her talent for singing had been her ticket out, her dream of a different life. Her love for Arthur, however brief, had been a shining moment. Clara, in turn, found a strange comfort in Daniel's presence. He had Arthur's way of tilting his head when he was listening intently, Sophia's infectious laugh that sometimes broke through his reserve. He was a blend of two people she was only now coming to know fully. The house on Rainbow Row, once so heavy with unspoken secrets, began to feel lighter. New memories were being made, layering over the old ones. One afternoon, Daniel sat at Arthur's piano. He hesitated, then began to play. Not classical music, like Arthur usually played for Clara, but a bluesy improvisational piece, full of longing and a quiet strength. Clara listened, tears welling in her eyes. It was Sophia's music, channeled through her son. It was a melody Arthur must have carried in his heart. Unheard by her, for all those years. He would have been proud of you, Clara said softly when he finished. Not just for the music, for the man you've become. Daniel looked at her, a rare open smile gracing his features. Thank you, Clara. That means a lot. Grace, ever observant, saw the transformation in her friend. The tight knot of grief and suspicion that had held Clara captive for so long was finally loosening. There was still sadness, yes, but it was a softer, more contemplative sorrow, mingled with a burgeoning sense of connection. Olivia eventually wrote her article. It wasn't the sensational piece some might have expected. Instead, it was a poignant, deeply human story of discovery and reconciliation. She changed names, protected identities, but the emotional truth of Clara's and Daniel's journey resonated deeply with readers. It spoke of the secrets we all carry and the healing that can come when those secrets are brought into the light with courage and compassion. As the Charleston summer began to wane, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't uproot his life in Chicago entirely, not yet, but he would come back, often. There was too much here now, a history, a family, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing so profoundly. Clara stood with him, on her porch, as he prepared to leave for his flight. The roses were in their final, glorious bloom of the season. "You'll come back soon?" she asked, not as a question, but as a statement of hope. "I will," Daniel promised. He leaned in and for the first time kissed her gently on the cheek. "Take care, Clara." She watched him walk away, a tall figure receding down the historic street. Then she turned and went back inside her house. It no longer felt empty. It felt full. Full of the past, yes, but also full of the present, and the promise of the future she hadn't expected. She walked over to the piano. She lifted the lid of the bench. The hidden drawer was still there, but now it held no fear for her, only memories, and the silver rattle, which she now kept polished, a tiny beacon. Later that evening, Clara sat in her garden, the scent of roses enveloping her. She thought of Arthur, of Sophia, of Daniel. She thought of the intricate, often painful ways lives intertwine. The silence of the roses was no longer a silence of secrets, but a silence of peace. A new melody had begun, and Clara Jenkins, against all odds, found herself ready to listen. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning.